Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It was one of those Saturdays where I'd finally carved out a few hours just for myself. My phone was off, the emails were muted, and I had a glass of wine breathing beside my laptop while I skimmed through some pitch decks. It wasn't glamorous, nothing ever really is when you're running a company, but at least it was quiet. Peaceful. Or at least it was until I heard the knock. No, not a knock, more like an aggressive, impatient pounding, followed by the jingle of my front door handle. I didn't have to guess. I already knew. It was Lindsay. I opened the door and there she was, standing with that familiar frazzled energy, one kid on her hip and another tugging at her sleeve. Her eyes scanned my living room like it personally offended her, like it was too clean, too calm, too adult. Without waiting for an invitation, she marched inside like she owned the place, dropping her bag by the couch and barking at the kids to sit still. The older one immediately started flipping through the magazines on my coffee table, already smudging them with sticky fingers. I hadn't even said hello yet. "Claire, I need you to watch them for a few hours," she blurted, voice already edged with desperation and expectation. Something came up. An emergency. Her emergencies were always last-minute coffee dates with friends, quick errands that somehow turned into shopping sprees, or some vague obligation she never quite explained. I looked at her, then at the kids, then back at her. "No," I said, flat. "Not today." She blinked, like I'd slapped her. "Excuse me?" I said, "No, Lindsay. I'm not babysitting today. I have work and I'm tired." Her mouth dropped open as if the words were foreign to her. "You don't have kids, Claire. You don't know what tired even means." I kept my voice calm, even though I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "That doesn't mean I'm not allowed to be tired. Or that my time doesn't matter." That's when she snapped. Her voice rose so suddenly it startled even the kids. "You owe me. You owe me, Claire. I gave up everything to be a mom." I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I should laugh, cry, or scream back. Instead, I exhaled slowly and said, "And I built a company while you were asking me for grocery money." Her face twisted. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means, Lindsay. You've spent years throwing your choices at my feet like they're my burden to carry. You chose to have 3 kids with a man who barely shows up, and you act like it's my job to pick up the slack." She glared at me, eyes narrowing like daggers. "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said, stepping closer, keeping my voice low but sharp. "I think I stopped letting you drain me dry." There was a long silence. The kids were unusually still, sensing the weight in the room. Lindsay's lip trembled, but not from sadness, no, it was rage. Righteous, burning rage. The kind that comes from entitlement, not injustice. "You selfish bitch," she spat. "All you care about is your stupid company and your designer couch and your perfect little apartment. God, no wonder you're alone." I should have been hurt. Maybe a few years ago I would have been. But now? I just felt done. I walked over to my phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter. I picked it up slowly, deliberately, and turned to face her. "You know what's funny, Lindsay?" I said, almost conversationally. "I've let a lot of things slide. A lot. But there's one thing I never forgot." She tilted her head, confused now. "What the hell are you talking about?" I unlocked my phone, my thumb hovering over a particular saved file buried deep in my voicemail inbox. "I've been sitting on something for a while now," I said, my tone still calm, almost gentle. "Something you didn't know I had." The color began to drain from her face, just a little. She squinted at the screen in my hand, then looked back at me. "What are you doing?" "I'm just deciding," I said, glancing at her, "whether now's the right time to play it." She tried to scoff, but it sounded forced. "Play what?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll see." And just like that, the room shifted. The air felt thick with tension, not just from the argument, but from the weight of something unspoken, something hidden and waiting. Lindsay had no idea what I was holding. But for the first time in years, I had the upper hand. And it felt damn good. Looking back now, I don't even know when the shift really happened, when the roles cemented themselves so deeply into our family story that we stopped even questioning them. Maybe it was always like that, just hidden beneath the polite conversations and the fake smiles at holiday dinners. But the truth is, Lindsay has always needed more. More attention, more help, more sympathy, more grace. And I was always the one who didn't need anything, at least that's how everyone liked to tell it. I was the independent one, the one who didn't cry at the dinner table, the one who didn't bring drama to every family gathering, the one who didn't need to be rescued. When we were kids, Lindsay used to throw fits over everything. If I got a new pair of shoes, she would suddenly remember how uncomfortable hers were. If I won a spelling bee, she'd suddenly be sick with a stomach ache the next day, lying on the couch while everyone coddled her. It wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was strategy, even if no one wanted to call it that. She knew how to draw the attention back to herself like a magnet, how to make every room revolve around her needs. And for some reason, my parents let her do it. Hell, they helped her do it. By the time we were teenagers, the pattern had hardened into routine. I was the one who got a part-time job at 16 and bought my own clothes. Lindsay was the one who couldn't handle the stress, so my parents gave her spending money to make her feel better. I remember once, when she got caught shoplifting lip gloss at a department store, Mom sat her down on the couch and said, "Sweetheart, maybe this is just a cry for help." But when I forgot to unload the dishwasher one evening, I got a full 30-minute lecture about responsibility and setting an example. That was the first time I realized that in our family, being dependable wasn't a virtue, it was a burden. Once they decided you were strong, they stopped protecting you altogether. It didn't get better as we got older. It just got more expensive. In our 20s, while I was working 3 jobs and sleeping 5 hours a night to build my business from the ground up, Lindsay was bouncing from relationship to relationship, crashing on couches, and calling me every other month to borrow a few $100s because rent was tight or she'd overdraft again. And I gave it to her. Every damn time. Because I felt like if I didn't, then I was the bad sister. The selfish one. The one who let her sibling drown. There was one month, I'll never forget it, when I paid her rent, her electric bill, and even sent her grocery money because she said she was barely eating. I drove across town to drop off bags of food, and do you know what I saw through her window before I even rang the bell? A group of her friends lounging on her couch, drinking wine, watching Netflix like it was some kind of girls' retreat. I stood on her porch for 10 solid minutes, gripping those grocery bags like a damn fool, before I finally turned around and drove home. I didn't say a word about it. I wish I had. But even then, even after everything, I kept telling myself she was just struggling. That maybe I was being too hard, too cold. I'd been conditioned to believe that choosing not to help was the same as cruelty. That setting a boundary made me a monster. Ever had someone guilt trip you for their own choices? Ever been made to feel selfish for simply not being their safety net anymore? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious, how many of us carry that quiet resentment, tucked behind polite smiles and swallowed words, just to keep the peace? Because I know I'm not the only one. The worst part is, Lindsay always found a way to flip it around. If I helped her, she made me feel like it was only right. If I didn't, she made me feel like I'd failed her somehow. And every time she slipped, it was never her fault. It was her ex's fault, or her boss's fault, or the economy's fault. And every time I picked up the pieces, I was enabling her, but no one dared say it out loud. I remember one night, not too long before everything boiled over. I'd just come back from a business trip, exhausted, jet-lagged, emotionally fried, and there she was, sitting on my porch like a ghost. She looked wrecked. Eyes red, mascara smudged, clothes wrinkled. I almost didn't open the door, but I did. And she cried on my couch for hours, told me how she felt lost, how she didn't know who she was anymore, how being a mom had swallowed her whole. I made her tea, gave her a blanket, and told her she wasn't alone. She thanked me, said I was the only one she could count on. And then, 2 days later, she told our mother I was cold and unavailable, and that I only cared about my stupid company. That was the moment something inside me finally shifted. I started pulling back. Not all at once, just enough to breathe again. I stopped answering every call. I started saying no, gently at first, then more firmly. And every time I did, Lindsay would push back harder, digging into guilt like it was her weapon of choice. And then came the voicemail. That voicemail, God, I still remember the way my heart dropped when I first heard it. The sound of her voice, laughing with someone else, mocking me like I was nothing more than a walking ATM with a pulse. That was the night I almost cut ties completely. That was the night I knew, truly knew, what she really thought of me. That she didn't see me as her sister anymore. I was just her plan B. Her backup parachute. Her safety net. I didn't play it for anyone back then. I wasn't ready. But now? Now it's just sitting there waiting. And something tells me its time is coming. I wish I could say I was surprised the first time I heard that voicemail, but the truth is, it didn't shock me so much as it confirmed everything I had already suspected in my gut, but didn't have the courage to admit out loud. It was one of those nights when the universe decides to peel back the curtain just a little and show you what people really think when they believe you aren't listening. I remember it was a rainy Thursday evening, and I was in the middle of answering emails on my laptop when my phone buzzed and lit up with a missed call from Lindsay. Nothing unusual about that. She called often, sometimes just to rant about her kids, sometimes to ask for a favor, and more often than not, to float around the topic of money without asking directly. But this time, there was a voicemail notification. I didn't even play it right away. I let it sit for a few minutes while I finished responding to a client about a product pitch. I figured it was just another ramble about how hard things were at home or how I needed to understand her struggles better. I wasn't in the mood. But something tugged at me, call it intuition or just exhaustion. I clicked play, expecting to hear her voice laced with fatigue and guilt-tripping undertones. Instead, what I got was something else entirely. At first, I heard static and a bit of background noise, the kind you get when someone thinks they've already hung up. Then came laughter, hers, unmistakably hers, and another voice, one I didn't recognize. It was a woman, probably one of her friends from that chaotic circle she always gravitated toward, the kind of women who measured success by wine nights and Facebook likes. I'll never forget the first sentence I heard in Lindsay's voice, giggling between sips of whatever they were drinking. "Oh please," she said, voice full of arrogance. "Claire's basically my emergency fund in heels. All I have to do is sound desperate enough and boom, instant Venmo." Her friend laughed, a deep, guttural sound like she'd heard this routine before. "You serious? She just gives you money like that." And then came the line that burned itself into my memory forever. Lindsay responded with a smirk in her tone. "She's so easy to manipulate if you pretend you're struggling. Just toss in a few tears and mention the kids. Works every damn time." I sat there, jaw slack, phone still pressed to my ear as the laughter rolled on. They continued talking, shifting to other topics, making jokes I can't even remember now because my mind had gone completely still. Everything else faded into a blur except those words, sharp, casual, cutting in a way no direct insult could ever be. I didn't delete the voicemail. I didn't confront her either. I didn't even cry, although I probably should have. Instead, I sat there in the stillness of my living room, staring at the dark window, wondering how long she had been doing this. How many times I had opened my wallet out of compassion while she rolled her eyes behind my back. How many times she'd painted herself as the struggling saint while turning me into the gullible, cold-hearted workaholic. I saved the voicemail, tucked it deep into my phone's archive, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. I needed the truth to live somewhere other than in my own exhausted memory. I needed to hear it again, on the days when guilt started whispering that I was being too harsh, too distant, too unkind. And for a long time, I told myself I'd never use it. That it was better to just know the truth quietly than to blow everything up. I thought maybe, somehow, things could shift naturally, that if I just stopped enabling her, the dynamic would correct itself. But people don't change unless you force them to look in the mirror, and even then, most of them just turn away. Now, years later, that voicemail has started playing on a loop in my mind again. And I think it's because, deep down, I know I've reached the edge. What was once just a private betrayal has now become a public circus, with everyone chiming in like experts on a life they don't understand. My mother has begun dropping not-so-subtle comments about how family sticks together, and my father, as usual, has retreated into his quiet shell of non-interference. Lindsay, of course, has been dialing up her performance to Oscar-worthy levels, tears on command, stories tailored to make me look like some heartless capitalist who turned her back on blood. And now the whole family's involved, nodding along to her narrative like a damn chorus. They weren't there when I worked 18-hour days. They weren't there when I stayed up crying into spreadsheets and business plans while Lindsay blew money on God knows what. But somehow, I'm the villain because I don't want to babysit on my only day off. So yes, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to let them hear it. Not for revenge, but for clarity. Maybe they need to know the real story, straight from Lindsay's mouth. Maybe they need to hear the smugness in her voice, the deliberate manipulation, the casual cruelty of someone who weaponizes sympathy like a blade. And if it all comes crashing down afterward, so be it. Some fires need to burn before anything can grow again. I should have known something was off the moment I pulled into the driveway and saw Lindsay's car already parked in front of my parents' house. She was never early, not even for things she cared about, which made me suspicious the second I saw her minivan sitting crooked, half on the curb, like she'd rushed in on some urgent mission. The house looked normal enough from the outside, the porch light casting a warm glow over the steps, the smell of something vaguely nostalgic drifting out from the open kitchen window. But inside, I could already sense the temperature was different, the kind of difference you don't feel on your skin, but somewhere deeper, in your chest, in your gut, where intuition scratches like a warning. Dinner at my parents' house had always been a strange dance of polite obligation and subtle judgment. There were always the same dishes, Mom's dry roast chicken, oversalted green beans, and that god-awful gelatin salad she insisted on making because it was your father's favorite in college. Conversations were shallow, filled with polite updates, small complaints, passive-aggressive remarks disguised as observations. But tonight, it felt like there was a script already written, one that I wasn't handed. I walked in, set down the bottle of wine I'd brought like some peace offering I hadn't realized I would need, and took a seat at the table. My father greeted me with his usual nod and half-smile, eyes flicking back to his plate before any real connection could form. Mom gave me a perfunctory hug, already glancing toward the kitchen to check on the rolls. And Lindsay, well, Lindsay had that look on her face, the one she wore like armor, a mixture of wounded innocence and performative humility, as if she were already halfway through some rehearsed monologue. The moment everyone had their food, she began. She didn't even wait for casual conversation to settle. "I just feel like I'm drowning lately," she said, her voice trembling in that perfectly calculated way, just enough to evoke sympathy without seeming dramatic. "It's just been so hard, trying to do everything alone. And when I asked Claire for help, I didn't expect her to treat me like I was some kind of burden." The room went still, forks hovering midair. My mother's head snapped toward me like a hawk catching scent of prey. "Claire," she said sharply, "she's your sister. You're supposed to support each other. You're so cold sometimes." I swallowed hard, not because I was shocked by her siding with Lindsay, that was practically a family tradition, but because of how swiftly it all turned against me. No one asked for context, no one asked what I had been dealing with, or how many times I had already bent over backwards to help. No one cared that I was tired, that I was overwhelmed, that maybe I too needed someone to carry something for once. Lindsay continued, eyes glassy, hands wringing her napkin like she was wringing out my reputation. "I've never felt so abandoned. All I asked for was a few hours. Just a little support. But apparently, Claire's time is too precious for her own niece and nephew." I clenched my jaw, trying not to let the heat rise in my cheeks. I knew this was coming. I just hadn't expected it to sting so much. I could feel my mother watching me, waiting for me to apologize, to smooth things over, to play my part as the responsible, unfeeling sister who always folds in the end. But I said nothing. I just listened. And the longer I stayed silent, the more Lindsay pushed. "You know what hurts the most?" she said, voice rising slightly for dramatic emphasis. It's that she doesn't even care. She sits there with her nice job, her expensive clothes, her cold little apartment, acting like she's better than the rest of us. But money doesn't make you human, Claire. And one day, when you're old and alone in that apartment, you'll regret choosing money over family. That was the moment I felt something shift inside me, like a door slamming shut. I looked at her, really looked at her, not just the sister I grew up with, but the woman she'd become. Manipulative. Entitled. Cruel in a way that didn't even require raised voices or slurs, just the slow, calculated twisting of words designed to wound deeply and silently. I picked up my phone from the table, calm as ever, my fingers brushing the screen as I scrolled with purpose. The table fell into silence again, everyone watching me like I'd just pulled out a weapon instead of a smartphone. "No, Lindsay," I said quietly but firmly, my voice steady in the thick air of tension. "You didn't choose family. You chose manipulation. And I've got proof." Her face paled instantly, the color draining from her cheeks as if she'd seen a ghost. My mother's mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but no words came out. Even my father looked up from his plate now, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, the first sign of real interest he'd shown all night. I didn't press play. Not yet. But I let my thumb hover near the screen long enough for everyone at the table to realize that this wasn't some idle threat. This wasn't some petty response. This was something else entirely, something undeniable, something real, something that would burn through every carefully crafted lie Lindsay had ever wrapped herself in. And in that moment, in the quiet before the storm, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't afraid of the fallout. I wasn't afraid of being the black sheep anymore. I wasn't afraid of losing their approval because I never really had it to begin with. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally time to stop pretending I needed it. For a moment, everything stood still in that dining room, like time itself had gone thick in the air, heavy with the weight of the words that had just left my mouth. I could see the tension ripple across Lindsay's face as she scrambled to figure out whether I was bluffing, whether this was just some last-ditch bluff to shut her up in front of our parents. But the fear in her eyes betrayed her before a single word came out, because deep down, she knew exactly what I was talking about. She knew the voicemail existed. Maybe she had forgotten the details or convinced herself I had deleted it years ago, but her reaction told me all I needed to know. She hadn't forgotten what she said. Not really. I looked at my phone again, thumb hovering over the screen as I stared at the file I had saved so many months ago, its title cold and clinical, just a date and a timestamp. Nothing dramatic. Nothing flashy. Just evidence, quiet and deadly. For years I had kept it buried, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I wanted to protect myself from becoming the kind of person who would use it. I had always believed there was more dignity in walking away than in fighting back. But dignity doesn't get you peace. Dignity doesn't get you boundaries. And dignity sure as hell doesn't make people stop walking all over you when they've made a habit of it. Without another word, I pressed play. At first, there was only static, brief and muffled, the kind of noise people instinctively dismiss. But then came the sound of Lindsay's voice, bright and laughing, so casually cruel it made my stomach turn even after hearing it a dozen times before. "Oh please," she said, her tone dripping with smugness. "Claire's basically my emergency fund in heels. All I have to do is sound desperate enough and boom, instant Venmo." The room went so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock above the dining table. No one breathed. No one moved. "She's so easy to manipulate if you pretend you're struggling," Lindsay continued on the recording, the laughter in her voice now echoing in the silence of the room. "Just toss in a few tears and mention the kids. Works every damn time." There was a long pause after that. The audio faded into muffled background noise again, the kind you don't even register until it's the only sound left in the room. I set the phone down gently on the table, face up, the screen still glowing like a quiet accusation. I didn't look at anyone right away. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The shift. The unraveling. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp slipping out before she could stop it. Her eyes darted from the phone to Lindsay, searching for some explanation that would make it all make sense again, some excuse she could cling to that would allow her to keep seeing Lindsay as the wounded daughter and me as the cold one. But no excuse came. Nothing could explain away what she'd just heard. My father, who had remained silent for most of the evening, finally looked up from his plate. His eyes locked onto Lindsay's, steady and strangely calm, but colder than I had ever seen them before. "So that's who you really are, huh?" he said, not loud, not angry, just tired, like a man who had seen the truth one too many times and could no longer pretend it wasn't staring him in the face. Lindsay opened her mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, her fingers twitched, and her eyes darted wildly between us, like she was scrambling to find a version of events that could erase what had just been laid bare. She looked smaller suddenly, not vulnerable, not sympathetic, just exposed. Raw. Cornered. I stood up slowly, not in anger but in finality, like someone closing a chapter that had dragged on far too long. I looked at each of them, my mother, still frozen in shock, my father, stone-faced and silent, and Lindsay, now pale and shaken. "You want to talk about sacrifice?" I said, my voice low but cutting through the room like glass. I sacrificed peace for years to protect a family that never gave a damn about me. I gave up sleep, time, money, energy, and dignity, just to keep being the good daughter, while you all pretended not to see what she really was. Lindsay finally found her voice, shrill and desperate now, reaching for the one tool she had always relied on: denial. "It was a joke," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean it." "Claire, come on, you're twisting this." But before she could finish, my father raised his hand slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to warning. "Stop," he said, his voice deeper than I'd heard in years. "Just stop." And then he looked at me, eyes heavier now, like he'd been holding something for far too long. "You think this is the first time we've heard this kind of thing from her?" he asked, not to defend me, but as if he were pulling a curtain back on something none of us had expected. "You think I didn't know she's been using you? You think I didn't notice all the money she was taking, first from me, then from your mother? She's been doing this since college, Claire. You just happen to be the one who's stuck around long enough to keep covering the gaps." The words hit harder than I expected, not because I was surprised by Lindsay's behavior, but because I had never known just how much everyone else had known and chosen to ignore. My mother stared at him in disbelief, shaking her head like she couldn't process the confessions spilling out in front of her. "You never told me," she whispered. He didn't even flinch. Would it have changed anything? And in that moment, I realized something else, that this wasn't just about Lindsay or a voicemail or an awkward dinner. This was about decades of silence, of complicity, of choosing comfort over truth. And the truth had finally walked in and taken a seat at the table. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed, no one said anything at all. The room held its breath like it too was stunned by the weight of what had just been dropped, and I stood there, halfway between fury and relief, barely able to believe that someone else, finally, someone else, had spoken the truth out loud. My father's voice still rang in the air, that quiet but cutting tone he so rarely used, so rarely needed to, because in this family, silence was the preferred form of communication. But not tonight. Tonight, he had finally ripped the curtain down, and all the secrets that had been festering in the dark came spilling into the open with it. I looked at him, not quite sure what to say, not quite sure whether I felt vindicated or just hollow. He sat back in his chair, shoulders sagging slightly, like a man who had carried too many secrets for too many years and finally set them down. He didn't look proud, and he didn't look smug. He looked tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from age, but from watching things rot from the inside and pretending not to smell it. "You knew," I said, my voice lower now, not accusatory but stunned. "All this time, you knew she was using me?" He nodded once, slowly. "She came to me more than once over the years," he said quietly, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder, like he couldn't quite face me directly. "Said she was in a bind. Said she just needed a little help getting by. Said you'd already helped her, but that it wasn't enough. She made it sound like you were cruel for cutting her off. I let out a bitter laugh, sharp and humorless. And you gave it to her. Of course I did, he said, not defensively, not apologetically, just flatly. Because I thought I was protecting her. I thought maybe if I helped, she wouldn't keep running to you. I didn't realize how deep it had gone until it was already years in. And you didn't tell me, I said, more to myself than anyone else. He looked at me finally, his expression unreadable. Your mother knew, he said, and those 3 words hit harder than anything he'd said all night. I turned to her, eyes narrowing, pulse hammering in my ears. You knew. She looked cornered, unsure whether to admit it or keep pretending. But there was no room left for denial in that room anymore. I didn't know how bad it was, she said, voice trembling just slightly. I just thought she was struggling, Claire. I didn't want to make things worse. You didn't want to make things worse for her, I snapped, the anger rising now, finally cutting through all the years of swallowing it down. What about me? What about the years I spent bleeding myself dry trying to keep everything afloat while you stood there and watched her siphon every ounce of energy, time, and money I had? She looked away, lips pressed into a thin line, not brave enough to say the truth and not honest enough to lie properly. I realized then that she wasn't clueless, she was complicit. She had known, and she had chosen silence, chosen Lindsay, chosen comfort over confrontation. And that choice had a price, one that I had been paying in full for far too long. I didn't make a scene. I didn't yell or cry or demand apologies that I knew I would never get. Instead, I straightened my shoulders, picked up my purse from the back of the chair, and walked toward the door. The room stayed silent, no one daring to stop me, not even Lindsay, who sat in stunned silence, still trying to process how her carefully crafted narrative had just unraveled in less than 20 minutes. I didn't look back when I left. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out of that house, out of that history, out of that sick little ecosystem where manipulation thrived and truth got buried under casseroles and polite conversation. The night air felt sharper than usual, cleaner, like the world had shifted just slightly under my feet, and I breathed deeper than I had in years. The next day, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began making changes. I called my attorney and told him I wanted to remove Lindsay from my will entirely. Every cent, every asset, every piece of legacy I had worked for, I no longer wanted it to touch her hands. I told him I wanted to cancel the automatic transfers I had set up years ago, the quiet little allowances I had convinced myself were harmless. And then I asked him to set up something new, a trust fund, but not for Lindsay's children. I'd already spent years trying to save people who didn't want to be saved. Instead, I created a fund for single mothers in my city, real women working 2 jobs, raising their kids without drama or pity parties, building something out of nothing with grit instead of guilt. Women who didn't weaponize motherhood like a shield, but lived it with integrity. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about redirecting my energy towards something that actually mattered, something that gave instead of drained. Let Lindsay scream. Let her sulk. Let them sit around and spin their own little versions of events, the ones where I'm the cold, heartless sister who turned her back on family. I don't care anymore. Because for the first time in years, I finally bought peace, and damn, it was worth every penny. And maybe some people will think I went too far. Maybe some will say I was cruel or selfish or ungrateful. But here's the truth they never want to admit. Sometimes, the only way to break a cycle is to stop feeding it. And if walking away from a family that never respected your boundaries is harsh, then so be it. I didn't burn bridges. I just stopped carrying the weight of everyone else's choices on my back. And that, finally, was enough.